Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report, a monthly public policy forum co-sponsored by the George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. These programs are funded generously by the Knight Foundation. I'm Marvin Kalb, a senior fellow at the Shorenstein Center. Our topic is journalism and corporate responsibility in wartime. Read the newspapers, watch television, listen to the radio, and you know what most of us already know. The United States is on the edge of war with Iraq. Officials speak of the start of war within weeks. Though they anticipate a quick war, no one, obviously, can be sure. Wars operate on their own dynamic. They have their own timetable. When the American soldier goes to war, the American journalist is not far behind. In fact, may already be on the scene. This time, something new has been added to the mix. It's called embedding, bringing 500 or more reporters into the military fold so that they eat with the troops, they sleep in the same tents, they face essentially the same dangers. Before, during, and after the war in Afghanistan, reporters demanded more access to the troops. And now the Pentagon, for reasons of its own, is giving them not only access, but total immersion. How good or bad might this all be? Will the news budget swell sufficiently to provide first-rate coverage for the American people? If a reporter is injured or killed covering the war, what should his or her news organization do for the family? In 10 or 20 years, is there going to be a newspaper? You know, the kind you pick up and read? Or are we going to get all of our news from the internet? How can we all protect the quality and the integrity of news that the American people need and want, given the economic, technological, and competitive pressures that we all face? We have the perfect panel of CEOs to answer these questions, perfect in the sense that the CEO really does have the power to make the key decisions. To my right, Kevin Close, President and Chief Executive Officer of National Public Radio, a job he has held since December 1998. He was president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and for 25 years was an editor and reporter at the Washington Post. On my left, only a matter of geography, Walter Isaacson, Chairman and CEO of CNN, a job he's held since July 2001. Within a few months, he'll become the head of the Aspen Institute. He's been a journalist for 25 years, starting as a newspaperman, then on to Time Magazine, and then CNN. To my immediate right, Arthur Sulzberger Jr., Chairman and publisher of the New York Times Company since October 1997. He's been a reporter since 1974, joined the Times in 1978, became assistant publisher in 1987. And to my left, Lou Bacardi, since 1985, president and chief executive officer of the Associated Press, which is the world's largest news organization. He's been in journalism since 1959, joined the AP in 1967, appointed executive editor in 1973. He has what's called experience, and lots of it. He's going to retire at the end of this year. Okay, let's get to the questions, and let's get to this embedded issue that I started with, this new Pentagon plan. The Pentagon is clearly doing it for its own reasons. Journalists who are going to be embedded, whom I've talked to, seem pleased by the whole idea. Should they be pleased? Are there hidden problems here? And Walter, why don't you start us off?
Absolutely. This is a good idea. They should be pleased. If you hadn't had embedded journalists, you wouldn't have had the picture of the flag being raised at Iwo Jima. You wouldn't have had Ernie Pyle's reports. You wouldn't have had the great war coverage that has made, that we've had in this country, for 2 centuries now. I went out to the Persian Gulf region with Ethan Jordan, our chief news executive, and was at Camp Doha and Qatar and Kuwait, talking to some of the 2- or 3-star generals or some of the commanders there, and they desperately wanted this. They said, we want our troops to be covered, not to have the war covered in the briefing rooms in Washington. And they were the ones lobbying the Pentagon because, as one of them said, or as General Wes Clark said, he said, you know, in the 1991 Gulf War, we had the biggest, most complex tank battle in history, and nobody recorded it. Nobody knows anything about it. We don't want that to happen again. And there'll be criticisms of what happens, what American troops do during the war, but we believe that the American troops are the best representative to the world as opposed to the briefers back in Washington. For us as journalists, yeah, there's a chance we're going to be co-opted by being embedded. In fact, some of the journalists who are against it call it being in bed as opposed to embedded, because you're going to get in bed with the military.
Rather had a great line the other day, by the way. He said there's a fine line between being embedded and being entombed.
Yeah, right. But, you know, look, it's the same on a political campaign. You get on a cocoon like that, and a good journalist knows how to cover it, and a bad one, you know, loses perspective. Lou?
Lou.
Mostly I agree with that, but I think we ought to wait and see if it works. There are risks with it. The right things are being said. The directives put out by the Pentagon talk about total cooperation and all and phrases that we'd write if we were writing the directive. Facilitate the coverage, do everything you can with transportation. So it says the right things. I would just want to sort of see it work a little bit before I thought that it was a great idea.
I think it's important, though, that we recognize this is not the only option. We're not being told you can only embed your journalists and units and that's the only way to cover the war. Between the Boston Globe and the New York Times, we're going to have about 15 slots, I believe, that we will use. And then we will have other journalists who are not embedded in those units, who will be out there in the field covering the war either to the north.
Arthur, how many others would you have aside from those being embedded?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but I know that we already have about a half dozen between the Globe and the Times who are already positioned around and in Baghdad, have nothing to do with our military forces. So this is a good opportunity, but like any opportunity, you don't want to put 100, for the reasons that Lou rightly noted, you don't want to put 100% of your journalism in it.
Kevin Close, what is your sense? Are we in for something that we're going to look back upon with a degree of professional pleasure or pain?
Well, I think it could very well be both. I think as long as the encounters, if they're armed encounters, that they go well for the forces in which we're embedded, I think there'll be fairly wide latitude for the correspondents to cover the story. If it goes badly, the eagerness of the generals, the 2 stars and 3 stars, to have it recorded that things didn't go so well, or that there were miscues and there was loss of life, either civilian or on the side of the forces we're with. I think that it may be a harder slog, and there may be a lot of tough issues that are going to have to be decided right on the spot. One of the things we have today, which is unique, unusual, and probably was not true except really in Afghanistan, is all of us have almost virtually instant communications via sat phone with our correspondents in the field. It gives people in the news centers the ability to talk very quickly to their correspondents to get a quick fix on what is happening.
But when you say a quick fix, can the correspondent also, in talking with the editor back in Washington, report news, or does the correspondent have to in some way clear it with the local military commander?
That correspondent is going to be reporting news for sure. And I think
without clearing it?
Well, I think there will be general, no correspondent who's going out there, first of all, is going out there to give away military secrets, either knowingly or in any other way. They're going to be protective of what they may know. In the first Gulf War, Neil Conan, one of our great correspondents in the field, there were things he didn't talk about. He knew, for example, what the altitude was that the bombing runs were being made at. We never put that on the air. That's the kind of thing that you wouldn't want somebody else to know. We know how to withhold. We know how to protect the forces we're with. The issues are, can they get to headquarters if there's a face-off between a general and the field, and what can they say, and how can the editors back who are not on scene, how can they be of assistance to the correspondents in the field if there are difficulties?
Directives, in fact, say there will be no prior review.
That's right.
So, as I said a minute ago, in the planning, in the description, it sounds okay.
Right. But at the same time, Walter, when you were out there, did you check on whether live coverage is likely, given the, I don't want to use the word constraints, given the control problems that may arise given the local commander's desire?
Operational security is the big issue. Or you're going to do something that compromises the operation.
Well, that would affect live coverage.
Yeah, and Kevin put it very well. You know, we're not dumb. We're not going to do things that'll mess up an operation. First of all, you get yourself killed.
But you may not even know.
There's
It's
a
not
lot
matter
of
being dumb.
That's why it's smart, I think, for them to have the journalists embedded. Because if day in and day out you're there and you're understanding what's happening, you're less likely to make a mistake, you're less likely to do something that is going to compromise security, and you work out the ground rules. I think the directives are very good. Easton Jordan was on our team. You had, I'm sure, a lot of people involved with it. They have very good directives. They're not censoring it. They're not going to say, don't report this because it will embarrass us. They're only saying, don't report things that could compromise operational security. And hey, that makes sense.
And they specifically say that embarrassment is not to be a criteria.
Right, that's what I meant. That's what I meant to say, yeah.
I would say as well, Marvin and colleagues, if you know, if the war moves quickly on the ground, I think it'll be a lot easier to cover, and these issues may not arise. If it arrives at Baghdad and there is a block by block defense of Baghdad, and it gets bogged down into very complicated firefights and that kind of grinding ground war, I think it's going to be a lot tougher for us to know how to cover it, and we'll just have to feel our way through it.
But as Arthur said, we're going to have people in Baghdad who aren't going to be embeds. I want to reinforce Arthur's points. I wouldn't just trust only embeds.
No, that's right. And the other thing I was going to say is that we need to recognize, too, that the military is taking on an enormous responsibility. They're taking in unarmed combatants who are going to be neutral in anything, who are not going to be picking up arms, and are going to, in effect, go right along with the troops, right along with the military forces, and have to be, in effect, protected at the same time they're recording what's happening.
The Pentagon knows that.
Yes.
And is doing it for reasons, I'm going to say cynically, of its own. Why do you think they're doing it? What is the point? Because they've suddenly decided it's wonderful to get on with the press?
It doesn't have to be viewed as cynical. This is not a new concept, as Walter started off with. This is a concept that's been used in previous wars, up to and including Vietnam, right? I
would have an argument with you on that.
Well, I'm thinking of Charlie Moore, for example, in Hue.
Sure.
But what I'm trying to say, to get out, is this thought. The military's ability to perform its task in a democracy depends on their support, in the end, of the people back home.
Exactly.
That is based on that's our job, to feed people the information that keeps democracy alive. This is how it ought to work. A recognition that the military is doing its duty and its job, and that's a good thing. That we're doing our duty and our job, and that's a good thing. And that's together what's going to make this war work, if it's going to work.
And together is going to be a very interesting point. Whether it can happen together.
I don't mean to suggest by that means that the American people will be supporting the action, but that they will have the information necessary to make informed decisions. The military's betting, and rightly so, I think, that what we will see is a professional military operating in a professional manner.
Right.
If this war becomes more bloody, more complex, they may lose support, but it'll be based on knowledge, and that's a healthy moment in a democracy.
It is a risk. It is a risk that the Pentagon is accepting, and it is a risk that they acknowledge. It is a risk that they acknowledge. They want very much to win public support, and they feel that one way they can do that now is to somehow or another get reporters in with the troops, and in the long run be more sympathetic.
That's why I would disagree with the way you phrased it. They're doing it because it's in their own interest, but that's not cynical. Mm-hmm. It is because their interest is that the people in the United States see how the war is being fought, and they have a direct, and that's what democracy is about, and that's what we're about.
And all of the record of the conflicts between the Pentagon and the press you think are all going to go to bed.
No.
They're all going to
No.
be forgotten.
That's why this is not, you're going to see those conflicts, and there's going to be some clashes, and there's going to be some disagreements, but we're not going to be kept away the way we were during Afghanistan.
How do you
where
know
we
that at a
couldn't-
certain point the general is going to say, I don't want CNN here. I don't like the report of last night.
Yeah.
It is my responsibility to look after these people, and I don't like the idea that the reporters are this close. You are saying that you believe right now what the Pentagon is telling you. And I think we ought to pick
I
up the
believe it's in
discussion
their,
6
no, I
months.
believe what you said is right. It's in their interest to have it this way, and they'll keep acting in their interest.
Let me ask you.
What we can say now is what the ground rules that they've set down
are,
are.
right.
And again, let's see how they work. You know, we all revile the pools that were set up in Gulf
In
War
Gulf War
I. There are some elements in this new program that, while you don't have pooling of copy, which of course means that everybody shares what's gathered, there are some elements of that you could find if you held this thing up to a light. So again, let's see if
what
it
happens.
operates with the hazards and the obstruction
Fair
that,
enough.
that occupied us in the Gulf. There were stories that got lost in Gulf War, pieces that never got back, pieces that got back 3 weeks later when it was in irrelevancy because the war was mercifully so short.
Well, it couldn't be as bad as what they did in Afghanistan, where they kept us all away and it was just a mess, and every mistake they made is now being uncovered.
Let us, at this point, in fairness to everyone, shelve the very possibility of cynicism and say that both sides are operating
very cynical.
in the very cynical.
That's very cynical, what you just said.
That's, well, I want to put it aside. I want to
That's
say,
cynical.
forget it. Forget it. We all are going to operate on the basis of what the Pentagon has promised, and we'll see what happens. Let me just ask, because I'm curious, did any of you see the interview that Rather did with Saddam Hussein? Or hear that interview?
No.
I heard most of it.
You heard it?
Well, heard parts of it, saw, you know.
Saw parts
but
of it
no,
at
didn't
all.
see the whole thing.
What is, you know, the White House is in a bit of a snit now because they wanted to get an administration person on that program. There was some kind of a problem, which I don't really understand, but no person was placed on that program. I'm just kind of curious if you think there was anything wrong with what CBS did, with the interview, the way it was conducted, anything like that.
No, they did the right thing, and I think, you know, the White House is doing, excuse me, is doing its part too. It wants a piece of the action for itself. It would like to be there to rebut. It would like the same kind of audience or viewership that the Rather report received. But no, Rather and CBS, you know, we commend them because we're getting sort of unexpurgated Saddam Hussein in front of America, and a highly regarded American journalist, your colleague for many years at CBS. It's what ought to happen. And we can see for ourselves in this society whether we believe, disbelieve, accept, don't accept. Let's look at the man and let him take some questions from Rather and make his responses.
Good. Does anybody disagree with that?
The only thing I'd add is I felt uncomfortable the way the White House was playing that. That just felt a bit creepy, that they were trying to denigrate or make it look like CBS and Dan Rather had done anything bad, and that wasn't very becoming on Harry Fleischer's part.
Lou?
Well, the White House, the network also, as it's been reported, I don't know this firsthand, demanded that the president respond. And I think you can understand that maybe somebody over at Pennsylvania Avenue didn't think that was a good idea. So the notion that Saddam had free rein for propaganda without any kind of a journalistic check isn't so. I mean, I think Dan asked a lot of good questions.
And it isn't as if the administration has not had an opportunity to express
In a different forum.
its own
Well,
view in
Fleischer
different
gets
ways.
to go on the air every day, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Arthur, I want to ask this question. Since 9/11, has the news budget of the New York Times gone up, given the fact that the demands of news have obviously gone up considerably?
No, the news budget has not gone up. The amount of money they've spent has gone up, however.
Meaning they're,
They went way past budget. I mean, look, we don't budget for wars. We don't budget for horror. We don't budget for tragedies like 9/11. We budget for, you know, a reasonable news cycle, not unlike the last 12 months, and then plus whatever new things you might want to add to the quality of the paper or new hires you want to make. And then if 9/11 happens, we sort of burn the budget, because that's our job. Our job is to get the news out, and that's our reason for being. That's our core. So are we budgeted for this war? No, we are not budgeted
There
for
is,
this war.
in other words, there's not a specific amount of money that the New York Times has set aside to the coverage of this war.
No, we don't operate that way.
How much money, if you can share this with us, how much money does the New York Times Company spend on the New York Times news coverage in a year, this year, last year?
What is the newsroom budget for the New York Times newspaper has got to be about $180 million now, more or less. So
And was
it's a
it-
good
and was
chunk
it
of
about
change in the newspaper realm. In television, it would be, I think your budget must be much higher than that.
A little bit.
But that's about where it is.
And what was it before 9/11? Was it
No,
less?
no.
No.
I mean,
It's more or less in that same ballpark.
right, with a 4% increase. The important thought here is we're going to cover what we have to do to cover the news. And in an extraordinary year, we will go past our budget. We will try to do what we can to keep that budget down. If the big news is breaking, as it was in 9/11, in the foreign and metro areas, right? Maybe we'll try to reduce some of the spending we might have done in other areas. But you're not going to make up a 9/11. What you hope to do, quite frankly, is to make it up in other areas of the company, of the newspaper. So maybe we'll cut back on the amount of money we will spend in circulation or in advertising, so that the budget for the newspaper as a whole is still comes in, recognizing you're going to spend extraordinary amounts on the news side.
Arthur, that series that the New York Times did, I don't remember the exact name of it, but those short biographies of the people who were killed.
Portraits of Grief.
Portraits of Grief, I thought was absolutely magnificent example of journalism.
Thank you.
Was that something that you'd have to add to the budget to be able to do, or is that also just part of this?
That's just part. That came out of the minds of two of our reporter, two young women, a reporter and an editor on Metro, who were trying to find a way to get to what we were all seeing in New York, which was those signs posted everywhere saying, "Have you seen?" And we couldn't call them obituaries because we didn't know these people were dead or missing. Nobody really was. And so they came up with this idea of just trying to capture that thought by taking something out of that person's life and making a story about that person through that. We had no idea what we were getting into. No idea. But once you started it, it became so compelling. It was so clearly a way to help bring the community back together. It was a sort of a healing process that you couldn't possibly stop it. And we devoted, in the end, enormous resources to it. I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens of journalists.
Tell me why, because at a certain point you didn't stop it. So why did?
Over a year later.
No, several months later, as you went into the new year.
No.
No?
Well,
I think it was as you went into the new year.
You know, you may be more right than I am, but I know that we still went in
pretty
every
sure.
Sunday. We never did it. We stopped doing it as a daily section. I think it went longer than you think. We stopped doing it as a daily section and started to move it to Sundays. Why? Because, quite frankly, after some point, you run out of. Thank God, you run out of people. There were no. You know, it was the death count caught up with the Portraits of Grief. But everybody who wanted to be covered was, and some families chose not to be covered, and they weren't. And then they later on, when they saw what in fact was happening, called and asked that their loved one be mentioned. But we mentioned everybody who wanted to be.
It was a superb series.
But it's not a budget issue.
Okay, got it. Walter.
Except for Howell.
Howell Raines, we're talking about, the editor. Walter, how much does CNN spend on the coverage of a war? Do you have a figure that you could offer?
We added about $30 million for this quarter's budget, knowing, you know.
And what is the total budget?
I really probably can't say, but it's also complicated. And we have 20 networks around the world and stuff. But that was a significant amount, and it was.
I mean, ABC, for example, spends about $600 million.
I would guess we were a little bit more than twice that.
More than twice that?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
don't
the
say that
coverage-
too loudly, because the
the coverage of
corporation might
the
want
war-
to cut it back.
This 30 million
That was
is-
just to move people into Kuwait, Baghdad, extra people in the region right there. We
so
need
that
extra
the
money.
cost actually may be significantly more than that.
Oh, the
once
cost will be
war
much
takes-
more than that, but that was just the marginal cost of basing people in Baghdad, Kuwait, Qatar, and on the Constellation and other places.
Lou,
And-
with the Associated Press, for example, how do you handle that budget problem?
We start with a significant staff in so much of the world, and we're starting in the Middle East with large numbers of people, say, on the Israeli-Palestinian story, and we have people throughout that region. So the new expense is adding the incremental people that you have to put in. I'm not going to put a figure to it, but we will do what needs to be done to cover the war the way it should be covered.
Why is it hard to put a figure? I mean, you know the figure.
Yes.
But I mean, why is it hard? Why?
I just think for
is that a
competitive reasons,
personal-
it's competitive reasons, I'd just rather not put a dollar figure to it.
Okay, I don't mean to push you on that.
Well, sure you do.
You've noticed.
That's cynical.
And I am not cynical. I am not cynical.
In public radio, I might say the numbers of millions of dollars we have available is minuscule compared to what both these, or all three of these organizations have available. Our budget is, there's no secret about it, we are public radio. NPR probably spends about $35 to $38 million a year in its news operations, excluding the engineering costs.
So that when you have to cover a war, what are we talking about?
Again, like Lou, I don't really think it's sort of appropriate to put a dollar figure on it. We will do what we can do within the resources we have, and we will continue to cover it as thoroughly as we can. For us, it's an issue of when do we go to our member stations and say, okay, we're going live. We're now taking the air from the national feed. Because our member stations, it's not really a network. They're just, everyone is independent. They're all autonomous. They're doing their own programming. They take perhaps 25 or 30% of their programming comes from us. So when they actually give up the air and we go to a live feed that might continue for days, that's a huge issue for everybody in the whole system. The protocols by which we reach that kind of a decision, we've been working on for months with our member stations.
Is there an economic dimension to that?
There really is no economic dimension to it. It's really when do we know if the Pentagon calls and says the air campaign has started or the ground campaign has started, and we say to the stations through our Squawk network, we're going to take the air in 90 seconds. The question then is, how much further out do we go from that 90-second takeover of their air? It is not an economic issue. And they will, if they wish to drop the coverage or drop the feed, they can. When the Columbia disaster occurred, we did 9 hours of live right in the first day, and some of the stations stayed with us for 7 or 8 hours. They make their own decisions.
It was superb coverage, by the way. That Saturday coverage was really quite remarkable on radio. And it reminded me of the fact that networks that I used to work for many years ago, we used to take great pride in being able to do that kind of reporting. It isn't done as often on the networks any longer, certainly on radio. And that is a weakness, and NPR has managed to fill that weakness. Is there a special kind of responsibility that NPR feels?
I would say
at this point.
I think all of us here right here tonight in this conversation, and I'm sure the people in the room and listening, we all feel a responsibility to have access to breaking news, especially in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. I think all Americans are concerned about getting access to live news quickly, accurately, as accurately as they can. In my 4 years at NPR, there has been an extraordinary growth of audience. When I came there, the weekly audience was about 13 million listeners in this country a week. It's now 20 million. It's a 50% gain in 4 years. In the sequence right after 9/11, 4 million people who had never listened to NPR programming before came to it, and they've never left. It was 16 million before 9/11. It's now 20. That's a huge responsibility for us, for a nonprofit public service enterprise. And we feel it deeply. And we feel also the need, we know because of, as recently as the Columbia disaster, when something happens, Americans want to be able to get contact with it immediately. We've got to build that into our operation, which was not really a breaking news operation in its original conception.
Arthur, did you want to add anything?
I was just working off of your nonprofit thought. We are a for-profit, and we take that very seriously at the New York Times. And quality does matter. The added costs that it took us to cover 9/11 were paid for by the increased circulation, the number of papers sold that subsequent year. So we actually covered those added costs. So people came to the Times, and I think to other quality institutions, same in a way you're saying as your reach.
Yes.
And they paid for us, and that covered our news costs. So you know, it's a good cycle. If you can get into that quality cycle, it's self-supporting.
Absolutely. Lou, there is barely a week that goes by when we don't read about major news organizations cutting budgets, cutting staff, at a time when there's so much news going on, news that so many people need now. What's going on with journalism, do you think? Is this a sign of something very serious, very negative? Can it be turned around?
Well, there are serious economic realities that we all cope with, but if I can put in a small point of personal history, I began my career on newspapers in New York. There were 7 when I started. When I left, there were 4, and then there were 3. I don't wish anybody to connect my engagement with them with that reality, please. But we didn't, those newspapers didn't fail, and finally we put 3 of them together in one newspaper. Didn't fail because people stopped believing in the First Amendment or because we lost our loyalty to the First Amendment or our commitment. They failed as businesses. And you know, I think everybody needs to understand, even in the not-for-profit world that Kevin lives in and that I live in, these are large businesses which have to be run efficiently and have to be run in a way that makes some sort of economic sense. I don't have a shareholder as someone in the company like Arthur's has, but we're owned by the American news industry, and so much of that is driven by some of the financial concerns. So we feel them too. You ask me, is it a problem? Sure, there are financial pressures on staffs everywhere, and some staffs have had to be cut. Does that mean that less gets done? It certainly means that different things get done. You hope that as you make those decisions that the 9/11 and the war and the other things that are important to your community get done, and you're a smart enough editor or publisher to see that what falls off the bottom is what was at the bottom. But I think it's silly to deny the role of economics in what we do. There is a high calling to the profession that's represented, I guess, up here and I guess in the room as well. There's a high calling to it, but they're businesses too.
Walter, you'll remember that right after 9/11, the networks, yours included, did not run any ads for a period, I think, of 4 or 5 days, and lost, as a result of not running those ads, a great deal of money. Do you have plans now, before the war with Iraq begins, if there be a war, as to how many days you're going to go without ads? And I am presuming that there will be a decision on no ads.
Yeah, CNN and the people there won't have ads at the beginning of the war. I think we don't have a little plan that after 4.5 days it'll change, but it's the same with the Challenger disaster. I mean, you go 9 hours,
yes,
say, without ads. 9/11, you go 4 or 5 days without ads. It's one of the things that after a few days, you begin looking at each other and say, do you think it feels appropriate yet to bring back ads? And you don't know. I mean, you can't sort of say, let's do 4 days, because it could be a really bloody war, or it could be, you know, a prolonged airstrikes for weeks on end.
So from what you know about the budget now, and understanding, as I said before, that war has its own timetable.
Yeah. It's just not appropriate to run ads.
How long can you go without running ads?
Oh, I think you can. As Arthur said, you can destroy yourself and the faith that people have in you if you start doing things like not covering 9/11 as well as the New York Times covered 9/11, or start running ads right when people, you know, the war is very intense. I think you hurt yourself financially if you make the misstep in either direction. Yeah, it will cost us a lot of money. I mean, it's going to be brutal in the sense of what the war costs to cover and the fact that you're not going to run advertising on. But that's why we're in this business and that's what we do. And it'll be a few days or until the time feels appropriate.
But your company has been, and I'm only saying this on the basis of reading newspapers, but your company seems to be battered around almost every day. People are leaving, you yourself leaving soon. There appears to be a very heavy economic toll on people. The impact of the economic problems of the competitiveness of the industry, your fight with Fox for ratings, all of these things take their toll, don't they?
Well, competition makes you better as well, and market forces make you better, and having to deal with the market makes you more sprightly. I think that, yeah, there's always commercial pressures, but a couple of years ago when I was, you know, early at CNN, we had 39 bureaus around the world. Now we have 40. We opened one in Africa. It is more important to be covering the world. Yeah, you cut back in a few other places. There may be, you know, certain correspondents who are covering the internet bubble, and well, maybe the internet bubble isn't as big of a story, but having a bureau and having another bureau in the region is good. I think market discipline is not the worst thing in the world, although there were times I was cursing it when it was causing me to have to make cuts.
All right, Lou, I want to quote for you one of my favorites from Mark Twain. There are only two forces that can carry light to all corners of the globe, and only two: the sun in the heavens and the Associated Press down here. Now,
He was right.
he was right. There's no question about it. He's a good writer also. But lots has changed since Mark Twain was writing. And one of the issues that has come up recently, a challenge for the Associated Press, and I'm sure for you directly as CEO and president, has to do with intellectual property. When you put out a story on the AP and it goes out on the wires, people who buy the AP service can use that service, and we have, and that's it. But when you put it out on the internet, somebody can pick that up and use it in a way that over which you have no control. Nor do you have, I think, any way of cashing in on some of that use. What are you doing now to protect yourself?
We retain an intellectual property right to that information and to those stories. And we are very vigilant about pursuing people who would make use of it without paying for it. It's pretty well established law that you can't just take somebody else's work and use it for your own economic benefit. I agree with you, this has become a more complicated question in the age of the internet, where you have site upon site upon site. But we maintain and have expanded, in fact, our intellectual property surveillance. We have staff attorneys who work on this, so you're right to raise a question about it, but we're very vigilant about it.
So there's a lot more legal work now with the AP.
In this area, there's more legal work. Yes, absolutely.
Is there a concern that you may have that at the end of the day, after a lot of these suits, that you may come to a decision that you're losing control of the product, because that the internet is so open and so wild that anybody seems to be able to reach in?
Well, you know, we might as well not sit around and complain that the internet exists, because here it is,
Yes,
and it's only going to grow.
Right.
And they're going to be, if there are 10,000 news sites now, there'll be 15,000 in a few years. So it's only going to grow. We control the origination of our product. The fact that it now moves so quickly, instead of at 66 words a minute, now at 10,000. Pictures used to take a half hour for one color picture. Tonight they take 6 or 7 or 8 seconds. So yeah, there's vastly more. And but the control of the quality control is absolutely in our hands. Control of where it goes is a harder issue, and that's the question you put to me. But we're not throwing up our hands. We will maintain AP's intellectual property right.
Do you see any danger at all that the AP may become irrelevant in the new world of the internet?
where's all that news and information going to come from?
I'm asking, what do you think?
No, I don't think irrelevancy is the Internet's challenge to us at all.
How would you
How can
define it?
anybody? Well, how can anybody who believes in free speech and the First Amendment and all the things we get together at panels and tell ourselves are good things? How can anybody who believes any of that be upset that something called the Internet exists? More speech, more free speech, more news, more communication. Those are good things. That doesn't mean it's open season on stealing somebody's work.
Absolutely. Arthur, you are both an old-timer in that you've been in this business now 8 years, but you're now the boss of this great news organization, and you are reaching into the new technology, and you are described as being very excited about the new technology. And do you see any pitfalls out there, any dangers? Are you concerned in any way, or do you just sort of, are you plunging ahead? Let's see what happens.
Do I see any pitfalls? Yes, I see nothing but pitfalls. You're talking about broken running. But think of the opportunities. So far I've heard you come out against capitalism, and I've heard you come out against the internet. And I know you don't mean to be doing those, but those are the reality of the world in which we operate. Is it is a capitalist environment
I want you to
with an
notice
internet.
that this guy used to be a reporter. And you notice the way he's reporting my comments? Very bad, very bad.
I moved to the editorial
Very
side
bad.
now. I'm on the
Anyway.
closer to
No,
the
please,
editorial
please.
board.
Internet,
We come down,
go ahead.
come down from the hills to shoot the wounded. How do you define a newspaper? By the word news or by the word paper? I define it by the word news. And my greatest goal is to get the news of the New York Times or the news of the AP when I was an AP reporter to as many people as I possibly can. That's my greatest goal. The internet is an enormous tool for me to achieve that goal. And I believe we now, every day, we register. The people who come on to the New York Times on the web have to register. They don't have to pay, it's free, but they do have to register. We know when people come on, we know to a fare thee well how many. As many people read us every day on the internet, unique registered users who read us in print. We have over the past 5-7 years doubled our reach. Doubled our reach.
But
that's
half of
good even
those-
by your standards.
Yes, indeed.
But half of those people are not paying you anything.
That's right. They aren't.
Not directly, anyway.
But the advertiser is.
That's what I mean,
Okay.
not directly.
And it's, you know, the advertising model works. Is it as good as an advertising and circulation model with those two pedals? No. Is it good? Yes. And does it drive people to the print version? Yes. Our second largest source of new subscribers to the New York Times in print is the internet. So this vision we
people who
all
discovered
feared,
the Times
this
by way of
vision
the
we all
internet?
feared that people would move from the print, because you have to pay for it, it's not cheap, to the internet where it's free. Well, it's the other way around. People taste us for free on the internet and now come to the printed paper, second largest source
Wait, let me
of
ask
new
you,
subscribers.
do you think the free
They-
model will work forever?
The free model to me isn't a free model. It's just an advertising paid model.
Yeah, I'm sorry, an advertising paid model works forever?
You tell me, you've got it.
How many people in this audience?
I mean, seriously.
Hang
I
on
mean,
a sec, Arthur, we can all learn something.
well, I guess you have both, don't you? But
Arthur, we may learn something, hang on. People
we're
in
not
this
in the
audience.
business of learning something. We're in the business of telling people things.
How many people in this audience read the New York Times by way of the internet? Significant number. How many? Thank you very much. How many of you who read it on the internet also buy the New York Times? Fewer, but I'd say about 20
No.
to 25%.
but
Is
you're
that of
missing-
any interest to you?
Yes, it's
Why?
enormous interest. First of all, to all of you, thank you. To those of you who didn't raise your hand in either, what is wrong with you? Weren't you? All right. It is my fundamental belief that if people come to us on the internet, we can over time monetize that. We already have. We are profitable. The internet operation of the New York Times is now profitable.
When did it start being profitable?
Last year. And is it as profitable as the New York Times in print? No, not even close to it. Could it afford to cover the news costs of the New York Times? No, it couldn't. But that's where things are heading. And whether they come to us in print or in the internet or increasingly on television, as we move into that vehicle, we are going to only really have to care about the fact that they're coming to New York Times News and Information, platform agnostic.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask Lou and Walter a question because both of them are, after many years of being superb reporters and journalists and editors, leaving the business. What is the sort of the large thought, the large observation about the business that you could pass on to students? Lou, start.
Well, permit me a small correction. I'm going to retire from AP, but I'm not going to leave journalism.
Okay.
We tend, I guess, to answer that question a little bit from our point of view, you know, the journalist's point of view. One answer I could give you would be to look at it from the viewpoint of the consumer, and some of what Arthur was saying addresses this too. I think one of the huge challenges we have is this magnificent diversification of media and of ways that people get information, and then the complexity of the information that we're charged with trying to explain to them. The news reports, newspapers, Our Wire, Kevin's radio broadcast, your broadcast, is so much more complex, and finding ways to help the people in whose name we practice, finding ways to help them understand better and deal better with this flood of information that's just endless. To me, that's one of the major challenges.
Sort of, we're being, not overwhelmed necessarily, but being
close to
given an enormous amount of information. And how do we work our way through it? I mean, is that the job of the journalist?
I wouldn't step so fast, so quickly away from the word overwhelmed. I think a lot of people do feel overwhelmed by the volume and speed of information, the omnipresence of it. You can't get away from us.
Right.
A lot of people will say us, meaning the media. So I think finding ways to help the people we serve cope with that is a major enduring challenge for journalism. And then to pick up on Arthur's point, finding a way economically to make all this work and not convince yourself that you're in one narrow sliver of a business. You need to reach out in whatever way you can to find an audience for what you do. And I see that happening already in the business.
Walter, what would be your, quote, final statement on journalism?
Good journalism and good people who go into journalism do so for a certain core belief, which is that the unfettered flow of information and ideas is the greatest driving force for freedom around the world. You can see it happening during my time in journalism from the 80s on. As information spread, tyranny started to come down. That's more important now than ever when we're entering a world in which there's a real clash between intolerance and a certain other approach. And I think we have to hold true to the fact that, hold true to the mission that journalism is a noble calling. It shouldn't get too compromised by entertainment or the pressures that get placed on it, or the type of things we do sometimes that makes us lose sight of what the noble calling is.
Most certainly is a noble calling, but isn't it funny that so many of the American people don't consider it a noble calling anymore? Mm-hmm. The polls that I have seen, many over the last 5 years, indicate a strong feeling on the part of many American citizens who depend on the news that you're providing. They have less respect for the journalist, less respect for the whole news business. That's a terrible thing even to recognize or to accept. And I wonder now, and I'd like to talk in the final minutes that we have on this program, about the relationship of journalism to government at a time when we are fighting a war against terrorism, and since 9/11, when so much seems to have changed. And I'd like to start with Kevin to get a sense of the relationship of the reporter to the government. We touched on this before, but just touched on it.
Marvin, I think it's the same relationship which has been at the center of the American experience, which is that we really, I think when we do our work as well as we can, we really are representing a fourth estate. We're helping citizens understand and probe into things that government does or that it doesn't do, and learn the reasons why those things happen and the explanations for it. And when we don't get explanations, we dig deeper. I think we're as skeptical in this time as we were before 9/11. We have many issues in front of us now that are brand new. The paradigms of how we think of ourselves in this, what had been a very protected society behind its oceans and its peaceful borders, and is no longer in the same way now in our minds as it was before the 11th of September in '01. Has that changed our role? It's made us, I think, stand up more and ask deeper questions, for example, about such simple things and complex things as who are the forces engaged in protecting or even dealing with the issues of protection of nuclear power plants? What are all the interests engaged there, all the responsibilities, all the ways you do it? So there's an enormous sequence of civil issues that we could put aside for another time that we're now dealing with in our news operations. What I do want to say, and Arthur knows this, and Lou at AP knows it, and they know it at CNN, and we certainly know it at NPR, the American people are looking for quality, serious presentation of ideas, of information, and of contact with serious ideas that engage us. We know from focus groups with our listeners, for example, that our listeners highly value our foreign news. We do an enormous amount of foreign reporting. You'll hear lots of people say Americans don't care about foreign news. It's dead wrong. We care, and if we can get people the news in a way that it's useful for them, that they can take it in their daily lives, they'll come back for more of it. And the way we do that is to pay a deep attention to to the sort of Jeffersonian principle, which was that a people can't be both ignorant and free, to say exactly what.
We've got about 4 minutes left, and I just want to point out that the Council on Foreign Relations in Chicago does an annual poll measuring the degree of popular interest in foreign policy. And they find consistently that there is a high degree of interest in foreign affairs, even when during the 90s, a lot of people in journalism took it upon themselves to say that there was no interest on the part of the American people in foreign policy. There are times, Arthur, when I have a feeling that maybe, given this war on terrorism, the nature of journalism's relationship to government might change, because the challenge is so different and awesome and threatening. What is your thought on that?
In the 2 minutes and 45 seconds.
No, I may
left,
give you only 45 seconds.
Exactly. This is something we're used to. This is our day job. This is what we balance this all the time. If we balanced it through the Cold War, and on the whole we did, and I would argue that the Cold War was a more dangerous time than this time is. I think as painful and as horrible as what happened in New York and in Washington was, were we really as in much danger as we were in those few days around the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we were how far away from nuclear holocaust? Okay, so I think we're used to this. We will come up with our own challenges every time, every generation does, but this is a balance that we know how to handle.
Okay, thank you. I hope you will come back and we can discuss that subject at much greater length, because I'd love to take you on that, but I can't now, because I too am under the gun. Lou, your feeling about this journalism-government relationship at this point in a war against terrorism, Iraq, whatever?
The temperature's gone up some, sure, but it's an old battle in a democracy, and I don't think it's dramatically different.
It's a battle that a back and forth. It happened since John Adams became president and every paper started attacking him. During World War II, you know, we started with Ernie Pyle, very pro-government. I mean, you know, the press and the government were generally hand in glove a lot of the time. Vietnam and Watergate, you see the pendulum swing way back in the other direction, so everything in journalism is almost by default adversarial, except for in certain cases. Now you do see it swinging back as times have changed, but as Arthur said, that's the balance that's what we do in the business, is try to strike that balance while remaining at all times independent.
It's a wonderful thing to hear professionals like you say that, because what it indicates is that we may be able to retain that kind of distance and yet close-up investigative journalism that is so terribly important. The only point I was trying to raise was that in a time of terrorism, we have been very fortunate as a nation up to this point, because it's only hit us once. Israel gets hit every week or so, and it has transformed Israeli society, as we know. Does it hold that risk of possibly transforming this society? We won't know, and I hope, in fact, that we never do know. I just want to say right now that our time's up, and I'm very sorry to have to say that, because I wish we could go on for a while longer. But I want to thank our panelists for a truly superb job. Thank you all very much for coming on down. And I would at the same time, I would at the same time want to thank you, because you all came out in a big snowstorm. And we appreciate that very, very much indeed. I want to thank the Knight Foundation once again for its generous help. Thank you, Eric Newton, for being with us. March is going to be a tough month. That appears to be clear, and it'll probably be a test in many different ways of strength, maturity, will. The easiest thing for a patriotic American to say is that he thinks, she thinks, we're all going to come out just fine. I think we will, and I have a feeling that the panel agrees with me on that, and I hope that you all do as well. I'm Marvin Kalb. Good night, and good luck to you all.